Imagine walking into a bank asking for a loan, and when the banker says no, you lock the doors and put a soldier at every window until he changes his mind. That is how the modern financial system of France was born. This is Tom from the Collapse Log, exploring the rise and fall of empires. Because behind every golden age lies a quiet decay no one sees until it is too late. The date is November 10th, 1799. A young general named Napoleon Bonaparte has just seized power in a coup d'état. He walks into the office of the Ministry of Finance in Paris, expecting to find the resources of a great nation at his disposal. He expects to find ledgers filled with tax revenue and vaults stacked with gold to pay his soldiers. Instead, he finds a ghost town. The finance minister is sitting at a desk surrounded by empty cabinets. Napoleon asks how much money is currently available to the French state. The minister opens the safe and counts out the coins. There are 167,000 francs. To put that into perspective, that was roughly enough money to run the French government for one afternoon. It wasn't even enough to pay for the postage stamps to send out the letters announcing that Napoleon was the new leader. The mightiest nation in Europe was essentially digging through the couch cushions looking for loose change. This is the moment where most revolutions die. You can have the charisma and the bayonets, but if you cannot pay the army, the bayonets will turn on you. Napoleon realized instantly that his greatest enemy was not the Austrian army gathering on the border or the British Navy blockading the ports. His greatest enemy was the balance sheet. France was not just broke, it was shattered. For 10 years, the revolution had waged a war against capital. They had printed paper money called Assignats until they were worthless. They had defaulted on the national debt in what was cynically called the bankruptcy of the two-thirds. They had guillotined wealthy tax farmers and confiscated the property of the church. The result was that nobody in France trusted the government with a single sou. If you had gold, you buried it in your garden. If you were a banker, you moved your assets to London or Geneva. The credit rating of the French Republic was 0. Napoleon needed cash, and he needed it immediately. He needed millions to equip an army to fight the Austrians in Italy. Without that victory, his new government would collapse in weeks. So he did what any desperate borrower would do. He went to the banks. Paris in 1800 was still a financial hub, but it operated in the shadows. There were men of immense wealth living in the city. Men like Jean-Frederic and Jean-Barthélemy Lecouteux. These were Swiss Protestant bankers who had survived the terror by keeping their heads down and their vaults locked. They had seen governments come and go. They had seen Robespierre and the Directory. They knew that lending money to the French state was a great way to lose your money and possibly your head. When Napoleon's aides approached them asking for a loan, the bankers politely declined. They offered excuses. They said times were hard. They said liquidity was low. They said the risk was too high. They were betting that this little Corsican general would last 6 months before he was overthrown like the rest of them. They were wrong about Napoleon. They treated him like a politician. They didn't realize they were dealing with a gangster. Napoleon understood that he couldn't negotiate from a position of weakness. He had to change the dynamic. He decided that if he couldn't get credit through trust, he would get it through terror. He sent out invitations to the most powerful bankers in Paris. It wasn't really an invitation. It was a summons. They were told to present themselves at the Luxembourg Palace. Imagine the scene. These men in their velvet coats and powdered wigs, arriving at the palace expecting a diplomatic discussion. They walk into the room and they don't see refreshments or comfortable chairs. They see soldiers. They see the hard faces of the grenadiers who had stormed the Legislative Assembly just weeks before. And in the center of the room stands Napoleon. He is 30 years old. He is thin. He looks hungry. He doesn't look like a king. He looks like a wolf. He doesn't ask for a loan. He tells them a story. He tells them that the state is chaos and that chaos is bad for business. He tells them that he offers order, but order costs money. He essentially places a proposal on the table. He wants to create a new bank, the Bank of France. But this won't be a government agency that can just print money whenever it wants. He knows they won't trust that. He proposes a deal. The bank will be a private corporation. It will be owned by the shareholders, and the shareholders will be the men in this room. They will sit on the board. They will control the interest rates. They will make the profits. In exchange, they must subscribe to the initial capital immediately. They must write the checks today. And they must lend that money to the state to fund the war. The bankers hesitated. They had heard promises like this before, but then they looked around the room. They saw the doors were closed. They saw the guards. The implication hung heavy in the air. You are not leaving this room until the deal is signed. It was a hostage negotiation disguised as a board meeting. Napoleon was offering them a monopoly on the French economy. But the price of admission was a massive upfront payment, and the alternative was unspoken but clear. If the state collapsed, Napoleon would fall, but he would likely take the bankers down with him. Or worse, he would simply confiscate their wealth by force without offering them a bank in return. One by one they signed. Jean-Frederic Perregaux. The astute survivor was the first to realize that this was actually a good deal. He saw that Napoleon was serious about stabilizing the currency. He realized that a private bank backed by the bayonets of the state could become the most profitable institution in Europe. He signed. Then Le Couteul signed. Then the others followed. They effectively capitalized the Bank of France with 30 million francs. It was a massive injection of liquidity. But more importantly, it was a vote of confidence signed at gunpoint. This moment changed history. Because the Bank of France was not like the banks of the Revolution. It was conservative. It was run by hard-nosed Swiss bankers who hated inflation. Napoleon gave them the power to issue banknotes, but he tied their hands. He passed a law that said every note had to be convertible into gold coin on demand. He told them, "I want money that makes a sound when it hits the table." This was the birth of the franc germinal, the most stable currency in the 19th century. For the next 100 years, the value of the French franc barely moved. It remained solid as a rock while other currencies inflated and crashed. But in the short term, that money bought Napoleon an army. With the cash from the bankers, Napoleon equipped the army of the reserve. He bought muskets, he bought cannons, he bought boots, he bought thousands of horses. And in May of 1800, he marched that army over the Alps. He descended into Italy and surprised the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo. It was a near-run thing. He almost lost, but he won. And that victory secured his hold on power. When the news of Marengo reached Paris, the value of the Bank of France shares skyrocketed. The bankers who had been forced to invest at gunpoint suddenly realized they were going to be richer than they ever imagined. Napoleon had delivered on his promise. He had brought order and victory. The relationship between Napoleon and the bankers remained complex for his entire reign. He never really trusted them. He called them a race of men who have no country. He hated the idea that his empire relied on their gold. He often bullied them. During the crisis of 1805, he threatened to shoot a banker named Ouvrard, who had engaged in some shady speculation. He forced the bankers to return illicit profits to the treasury. He treated the Bank of France like a piggy bank that he could shake whenever he needed funds. But he never nationalized it. He never destroyed it. He understood that the illusion of independence was necessary to maintain credit. The bankers in turn learned to live with the tiger. They knew that Napoleon could destroy them with a word, but they also knew that his wars generated massive business. They financed his campaigns. They managed the tribute payments from conquered nations. They became the gears in the engine of the French Empire. This story reveals a dark truth about the history of finance. We like to think that free markets and democracy go hand in hand. We like to think that financial stability comes from the rule of law and transparent institutions. But the Bank of France, the model for many modern central banks, was born out of authoritarian force. It required a dictator to force the capital class to align with the state. The bankers of Paris were paralyzed by fear and self-interest. They were content to let the country rot as long as their own vaults were safe. It took a man with a sword to force them to invest in their own nation. Napoleon's logic was brutal, but effective. He believed that finance was a weapon of war. He couldn't afford the luxury of a slow negotiation. He needed the money now. There is a famous story that later in his reign, Napoleon asked to see the vaults of the Bank of France. He walked into the underground chambers and saw the stacks of gold bars and silver coins. He turned to the governor of the bank and said, "This is where the empire really lives." He was right. The battles of Austerlitz and Jena are famous, but they were made possible by the meeting in the Luxembourg Palace. Without that initial loan extracted under duress, the Grand Army would have marched barefoot and hungry. The legacy of that gunpoint loan is still with us. The Bank of France exists today. It is one of the most prestigious institutions in Europe. But if you dig deep into its archives, if you look at the founding documents, you can almost smell the fear in the room. You can see the signatures of men who were signing for their lives. This event also set a precedent for how governments handle financial crises. When the system freezes, when the trust is gone, the state will use force to restart the engine. We saw it in 2008 when the US government forced the major banks to accept bailout money they claimed they didn't need. The Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson essentially locked the CEOs in a room and told them they weren't leaving until they agreed to the deal. It wasn't done with soldiers and bayonets, but the dynamic was the same. The state is the ultimate arbiter of value. And when the state is threatened, it will commandeer the financial system to save itself. Napoleon was just more honest about it. He didn't hide behind regulations or complex laws. He just put soldiers at the door. There is another layer to this story that is often overlooked. By creating the Bank of France, Napoleon destroyed the power of the old aristocracy. The old system was based on land and lineage. The new system was based on capital and credit. By elevating the bankers, Napoleon created a new elite. He gave them a stake in his regime. He made them complicit in his empire. He turned the moneymen into imperialists. This is why the French economy boomed under Napoleon. It wasn't just looting, it was confidence. Businessmen knew that the currency was safe. They knew that the bank would lend to them. They knew that the government paid its bills. Even after Napoleon fell, the bank survived. When the Bourbons returned to the throne, they didn't dissolve the bank. They embraced it. They realized that Napoleon had built a machine that was too valuable to destroy. The Franc Germinal lasted until 1914. It survived revolutions and coups and wars. It survived the Paris Commune and the Franco-Prussian War. It was the enduring legacy of a man who claimed to hate bankers. It is ironic that the man who reshaped Europe with gunpowder is also the man who stabilized it with gold. But we must remember the cost. The stability was bought with coercion. The system was rigged from the start to serve the needs of the military. The Bank of France was not designed to help the little guy. It was designed to help the emperor conquer the world. The credit flowed to the army contractors and the munitions factories. It flowed to the friends of the regime. The average French peasant saw stability in the price of bread, but he also saw his sons drafted to die in Russia. The quiet decay of the Napoleonic Empire came when the wars became too expensive, even for the Bank of France. When the looting stopped and the expenses mounted, the system began to crack. But the bank itself never failed. It just watched its creator fall. When Napoleon was exiled to St. Helena, he spent his time rewriting history. He portrayed himself as a liberal reformer, but he never talked much about the day he held the bankers hostage. Perhaps he knew that it revealed too much about the true nature of his power. It revealed that the emperor was just a man who needed a loan. And like all men who need a loan, he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. The story of the gunpoint loan is a reminder that the foundation of every great financial institution is political power. Money does not exist in a vacuum. It exists at the pleasure of the state. If you have enough soldiers, you can print your own money. Or better yet, you can make the rich men print it for you. So the next time you walk past a central bank with its grand stone columns and its air of permanence, remember how it started. Remember the nervous men in the velvet coats looking at the grenadiers. Remember the silence in the room before the first pen scratched the paper. Remember that the golden age of the French Empire was built on a foundation of extortion. And behind that quiet decay of the old regime lay the seed of a new power that would dominate the world long after the cannons fell silent. The power of the central bank. It is a power that started with a threat, and in many ways it still operates on the threat that without it chaos would return. The gun is no longer in the room, but we all know it is there.